February 3rd, 1880. Midnight. Shadows gather along a country road in Ontario. Bound by an oath, the mob's mission is secret, but what happens next will become legendary.
There's blood involved, and there's death involved, and there's mystery involved.
Now, for the first time, one of Canada's foremost detectives will re-examine the mass murder of the infamous Donnelly family using modern investigative techniques.
I'm not interested in reading about the folklore of the Donnelly case. I'm interested in moving right to the facts.
He will go through the family's final night, minute by minute, once and for all putting faces on their killers and exposing a widespread conspiracy. This quiet stretch of road leads to a crime scene that is more than a century old. Rarely have headlines been more shocking. Five members of the Donnelly family wiped out in a single night. A mother and father, two sons, a niece. The controversy still lingers, but the clues to the mystery lie buried in the past. The year is 1840. Having left Ireland in search of a better life, a young couple named James and Johanna Donnelly arrive in Canada with their infant son. Although they don't have legal title to the land, they settle near Lucan, Ontario, along a stretch of road called the Roman Line, named after the swelling number of Roman Catholic immigrants.
None of the land was cleared. They came and squatted, which many of them did, not only the Donnellys, but many of the families came and just squatted on land.
Tried to make a life for themselves like everybody else did. And it was tough work, it was a tough life, and if you didn't work hard, and if you weren't lucky, you didn't survive.
In the years that followed the Donnellys' arrival, Johanna gives birth to 6 more boys and a girl.
They were hard-working people, very family-oriented, and very loyal to their friends. Unfortunately, they had some enemies as well, and that's another part of the story.
The family will eventually become legendary, painted by myth, larger than life. In 1880, a mob will strike at them swiftly and secretly.
Somebody was guilty of killing those people. Whoever it was, somebody should have been found guilty.
Michael Boyd is one of Canada's most experienced homicide detectives. He has spent 3 decades with the Toronto Police Department and has worked on cases with the FBI. He plans to reinvestigate the Donnelly mass murder for the first time in more than a century.
I want to apply the same process of investigation that modern-day homicide detectives would use. To go back and review the evidence, the testimony, the information, the details surrounding the case from 1880.
Given the passage of time, the details of the 19th century crime scene are best preserved in original eyewitness accounts. Outside of Hamilton, Ontario, Michael Boyd seeks out preeminent Donnelly historian and former lawyer Ray Fazekas.
Hello, Ray.
Hi, Mike.
Ray, what do we know about the crime scenes?
What we know is what we learned from the neighbors, and then the police officers from London arrived on the scene.
February 4th, 1880, 2 a.m., near Lucan, Ontario. The Donnelly farmhouse lights up the sky. By dawn, a family's home is reduced to ash.
There wasn't much left of the Donnelly farmhouse by the time the police got there. It was pretty much a smoldering ruin.
Now, according to the testimony of Constable Alfred Brown, he says, we found
four bodies. There were 2 bodies lying together near the stove in the kitchen.
That would be right here.
And also another body was lying between the kitchen door and the door going into the front room.
And that would be right there.
The other body lay near the front door. I saw blood on the ground in front of the house, about 10 feet from the house.
The bodies were in such a poor state that when one of the constables tried to pick up one of the skulls, it just crumbled to pieces in his hand.
As news spreads, locals learn of another tragedy down the road, where a 5th member of the Donnelly family has been gunned down. Adding to the mystery, a boy named Johnny O'Connor claims to have witnessed the massacre.
Well, Mike, here we have the original testimony of Johnny O'Connor. Some people said that Johnny O'Connor was too young to have been very much reliable.
I see. So his evidence was being questioned?
Apparently not relied on.
Along with looking at the boy's testimony, Michael Boyd plans to carry out a step-by-step recreation of the night of the murders. Before he goes any further, he needs to put together the rest of his team. In Lucan, Ontario, Boyd meets with Sheila Hodgins of the Area Heritage Society. It will be Sheila's job to recreate the layout of the crime scene using a similar 19th century cabin as her starting point. Next, Boyd visits Gordon Lako, a renowned historical artillery expert. Gordon's job is to track down a replica of the shotgun used that fateful night. It will be tested for shot patterns, power, and distance. With preparations underway, Boyd moves on to the second stage of his investigation, taking a closer look at the Donnelly family in the years leading up to the murders.
For a family to be massacred by a mob of people suggests to me that there was some motivation built up.
By 1855, the Donnellys have been squatting on their land without legal title for close to a decade. Now 9 members strong, the family's way of life is suddenly threatened by a man named Patrick Farrell. Farrell has leased the Donnelly land for the absentee landlord, but James Donnelly believes his years of hard work have earned him a right to the property. A judge divides the land between them, a solution that satisfies no one. Across their new property line, hatred grows. It reaches a climax at a local land clearing party.
The story was that apparently Patrick Farrell and James Donnelly were drinking quite heavily, insults were made, and the next thing you know, these 2 guys were fighting each other.
In the heat of the skirmish, James Donnelly reaches for a handspike. Whether by accident or deliberate deed, the blow is fatal. Although James Donnelly is sentenced to hang, the punishment is reduced to 7 years imprisonment. The incident, as well as the relatively light sentence, divides the community. There is talk of vengeance, a possible sign of the bloodshed ahead.
People living in a small town, everybody knows everybody else's business. Nobody forgets the bad things. Certainly there was good on all sides, but there was a lot of bad blood.
This is Michael Boyd's first visit to the Roman line outside of Lucan, Ontario. It is in this very area that the 7 Donnelly boys gained their infamy while their father sat in prison. Just up the road lies the scene of one of Canada's worst mass murders. Near Lucan, Ontario, Detective Michael Boyd is investigating the 19th century mass murder of the Donnelly family. He takes his first look at the legendary family's land, now owned by Robert Saltz, a man who helps keep the Donnelly story alive.
So Rob, I take it this is where the Donnelly boys grew up?
This is where they grew up and where they came into their own.
Yeah.
It was on this very site in the early 1860s, with their father James still in prison, that the Donnelly boys came of age, under the guidance of their mother Johanna.
She must have been a very strong woman to raise those boys, to run the farm, and to keep things going. It was a big job. She was a very dominant person, but she would have to be to control all those boys.
Local legends will eventually portray the boys as monsters, evil troublemakers beyond the reach of the law.
The myths are that they were like a mad gang around the township. The myth that the men were bigger and stronger and, you know, almost giants in size.
The myths aside, at least 3 of the boys developed colorful reputations in their lifetime. James Jr., the eldest, is known as the Wild One, a heavy drinker with a quick temper. William is considered the brains of the family. Tom, the youngest boy, is also the strongest. Large in number and strong in character, the Donnelly boys polarize the community. They have close friends, but also strong rivals. When quick-witted William Donnelly marries a woman named Nora Kennedy, he makes an enemy of her brother John, a man who is angered that his sister would marry a notorious Donnelly boy. For Detective Boyd, learning of John Kennedy's grudge against William Donnelly highlights where his investigation needs to go next. In a murder case, a search for motive is key. He meets again with historian Ray Fazekas, this time at the University of Western Ontario Archives.
Ray, I now know a lot about the Donnellys, but I have to find out who would have a motive to kill them.
As already noted, John Kennedy is clearly a person of interest. Also, any relative of Patrick Farrell, the man struck down with a handspike years earlier, may surface with a motive of revenge. Looking for other suspects, Boyd turns to one of the most reliable indicators of community conflict: court papers. In 1876, just a few years before the mass murder, dozens of charges are filed against the Donnellys. The main plaintiff is Patrick Flanagan, owner of a local stagecoach line. At the time, the Donnelly boys operate a rival stagecoach line. Competition between the Donnellys and Flanagan is fierce and sometimes violent. July 2nd, 1875. While racing neck and neck with the Donnellys, a wheel falls off the Flanagan stage, sending the driver into the rain. He is dragged to his death. Although ruled an accident, there are accusations of sabotage. Less than 2 months later, the alleged attack is returned when Tom Donnelly, the strongman of the family, is cut off the road by a Flanagan driver. Whether justified or not, the Donnellys receive most of the blame in the crime wave that follows. It is a period in Lucan's history now known as the Reign of Terror.
Well, the so-called Reign of Terror was a great rash of fires that occurred in Lucan in a 6-month period.
The sky over Lucan lights up as barns, hotels, and stagecoach businesses go up in flames.
There is fairly strong evidence that their neighbors used the Donnellys' bad reputation to their own advantage. Like, say, one neighbor hated another neighbor, they might burn their barn down and say, oh, those darn Donnellys, they did it again. They became the community's scapegoats to a large extent.
William Donnelly is quick to defend.
Our new stage was set fire to and burned. We afterwards got another stage, but the Fitzhenry's hotel and stables were set on fire and burned to the ground, together with our new stage. The Donnellys did not do this.
After that, the Donnelly family was totally notorious throughout southwestern Ontario. They were this bad bunch, the Ku Klux Klan of Lucan,
Then they were accused of witchcraft. Well, they weren't witches. They were accused of poisoning animals. Well, their own animals had been poisoned. And I'm not saying the boys were angels, but they likely were not as evil as they were portrayed to be.
Looking more closely at the years leading up to the Donnelly murders, Boyd learns of 2 other figures directly at odds with the controversial family. The first is a 26-year-old man named James Carroll.
He kind of set himself up as the champion of the anti-Donnelly people, and so eventually he got himself appointed a constable.
I think a great many of the charges were trumped up. James Carroll was just trying to grasp at anything he could use, legal or otherwise, to get them out of Bidelph Township and become the hero of the community.
The cause behind Carroll's strong hatred of the Donnellys is difficult to pin down, but Boyd is intrigued to learn that the mysterious drifter is believed by some to be a relative of Patrick Farrell, the same man killed by James Donnelly Sr. in 1855. A second intriguing figure is a man named Father John Connolly. Roughly 1 year before the Donnelly mass murder, he assumes duties as the parish priest.
John Connolly was known as a zealous priest and one who stood for the faith and the teachings of the faith. And one of his problems was he always believed the first person who talked to him about any issue.
The first people he meets are members of the growing anti-Donnelly faction.
And he heard from them about these troublemakers in the town and this terrible family. I mean, the father is a murderer, he went to jail, the sons are ne'er-do-wells.
Next thing you know, Father Connolly's there in the pulpit saying things about the Donnelly family, that there's a bunch of people living in this parish that I'm going to straighten out. And, it just went from bad to worse.
Father Connolly soon goes beyond preaching. He announces the formation of a peace society to help stamp out the epidemic of crime in the area.
They signed an oath in the church to keep the peace.
My take on it, just my theory and my logically thinking, that it was probably formed with good intent.
But Detective Boyd finds something ominous about the oath book of the Peace Society. Suspect John Kennedy is a prominent member, as is James Carroll, rumored to be the leader of a more militant inner group. For the first time, the anti-Donnelly faction appears to be working together as a group.
Initially, the purpose was to prevent crime, and eventually it very quickly became dedicated to let's do something about the Donnellys.
For Boyd, it is time for a critical stage of his reinvestigation. He is ready to take a minute-by-minute look at the night of the legendary crime.
It's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to actually be there, to almost get your head into that scene as it's being described and as it was at that time.
February 3rd, 1880. In rural Ontario, it is a cold, bright winter's night. A mob slowly gathers.
Some had clubs, some had axes or hatchets, a couple of them had guns.
Inside the main Donnelly farmhouse, James Sr. and his wife Johanna are winding down the day. 3 others are present: Tom Donnelly, the youngest son, Bridget Donnelly, a relative from Ireland, and a 13-year-old boy named Johnny O'Connor, the son of a family friend. Detective Michael Boyd and Ray Fazekas return to the location of the Donnelly homestead to envision how the house must have stood in the winter of 1880. Next, they meet with Sheila Hodgins, who has reconfigured a similar homestead to match the Donnelly farmhouse on the night of the murders. They prepare to go over the murder minute by minute, using the controversial testimony of young Johnny O'Connor as a guide. A single candle burns. It is extinguished just before midnight. Outside, the mob quietly approaches the Donnelly farm. One man enters first.
He lit a candle, took it into the small bedroom where Tom was sleeping. He handcuffed Tom.
The move ensures that the strongest Donnelly won't be able to defend his family. With Tom handcuffed, the intruder wakes James Sr.
Johnny O'Connor awakens to a bit of commotion, and he recognizes a man standing in the doorway.
He held the candle for the old man to find his coat. The coat was under my head. When the old man got his coat, he went out.
Johnny remains hidden while the Donnelly family filters into the kitchen, unaware that a large mob has circled their home. A yell signals the men outside that it is time to make their move. The door bursts open as angry men rush in swinging weapons. A frightened Johnny O'Connor hides beneath the bed. He listens as the murderous mob beats the Donnellys. He slides behind a clothes basket, sure that he will meet a similar fate.
Tom fought his way apparently out of the kitchen and through the front room, ran through here.
Johnny hears Tom intercepted outside the house. He is beaten, then dragged back in.
I heard them throw him down on the floor. Then the fellow hit him with 3 or 4 whacks with a spade. I peeped out. I just looked out and immediately drew my head back.
Part of the controversy surrounding Johnny's story centers around whether or not he could see anything clearly from his hiding spot beneath the bed.
And what I'd like to do, just get some sort of sense as to what Johnny O'Connor could see, because he mentioned talking about seeing the foot of the stairs and also being able to look out and actually see some of the suspects.
Yes, and I can see the end of the staircase right now. And what he said under oath, I think I could see the same thing right here.
With dead and dying members of the Donnelly family sprawled across the floor, the mob prepares to cover their tracks.
They began to spread coal oil over the house and the bodies, and then they set it on fire.
I got out from under the bed. I went to the front room and saw Tom dead on the floor. Then I ran out to the kitchen. The old woman was lying between the door from the front room into the kitchen.
Once outside, Johnny O'Connor dashes for help. Ballistics shows Boyd the escape route taken by Johnny O'Connor. It leads out of the Donnelly yard and over to a nearby farmhouse owned by the Whalen family.
The neighbors, of course, wrapped him in a blanket and said, you know, what's wrong, what's wrong? And Johnny stammered out that the Donnellys were dead and their house was burning.
Furthermore, the boy claims to have recognized faces in the mob.
And the first thing the Whalens say to him is, shut up. You know, you're going to drag us all into court if you say this.
Inside the replica of the crime scene, Detective Boyd makes a telling discovery. According to Johnny's story, bodies lay in specific locations when he fled from the house.
Johnny O'Connor actually saw and was confronted with two bodies as he ran out. And he describes the two and where they were located.
These locations correspond exactly with where police found bodies the following day.
It makes sense. It adds credibility to his account.
In 1880, due to his young age, Johnny O'Connor's story will be greeted with skepticism. For Michael Boyd, a modern investigative technique called SCAN, or scientific content analysis, may put the speculation to rest once and for all. SCAN analyzes written testimony for signs of truth or deception. It is a kind of lie detector that can reach back into time.
I personally have used it on approximately 300 cases, and I can't find any flaw in the technique at all. I'll be looking for evidence that the person speaking is making a firm psychological commitment to the words that they're describing. In some cases, people's words betray their actions. What I'm seeing is the use of pronouns, William talking in first person past tense. I'm looking at the verb choice that he's making and the words that he's using.
Boyd notices many telltale clues in Johnny's testimony, but before he reaches any final conclusions, he first needs to follow the tragic events of February 4th, 1880, to their bitter end. After leaving one farm in flames, the mob approaches a separate Donnelly homestead. Inside, second son William is oblivious to what is now coming his way. February 4th, 1880. The Donnelly farmhouse burns. The men responsible for the blaze are on the move. A few miles away, William Donnelly and his wife Nora are asleep, unaware that 3 family members and a cousin are now dead. William's brother John and their friend Martin Hogan lie in a nearby room. Around 2 a.m., the mob approaches.
Then they went up the Roman line to where William lived, wanting to get William, who was my great-grandfather, for whatever grudges they had against him, probably many, and they started yelling out his name.
John Donnelly rises first. William stirs as he passes.
I heard John running through my room to the kitchen. I heard them holler, "Fire! Fire! Open the door, Will!" Then heard 2 shots in rapid succession. John fell back. I heard his head strike.
Hogan, a friend who's also in the room, sort of tells Will, stay in bed, stay in bed. They think that they killed you, and if they find out that you're still alive, they'll come back and kill us all.
William hears voices outside and steals a glimpse.
It was me they wanted. and it was me they thought they had shot. John was choking with the blood. The missus got a piece of blessed candle and hugged and held it in John's hand till he died.
Thinking their mission accomplished, the mob vanishes into the night. In total, 5 Donnelly family members have been murdered in the span of a few hours. Before looking deeper at the testimony of the 2 eyewitnesses, Michael Boyd decides to work out a century-old puzzle. It is believed that the gunmen were right outside the door when they fired at John Donnelly. If so, how could they have mistaken their target, leaving William Donnelly alive inside? Boyd returns to historical artillery expert Gordon Lako, who has tracked down a shotgun similar to the one used in the attack. The team uses their first test shot to demonstrate the gun's force.
Okay, here we go. Well, I think good heavens is the only word for that.
Yeah, that's powerful. Just gives you an idea just what that kind of shot would do to a human being.
Next, a distance test. According to the post-mortem report, the wound on John's body was 3 to 4 inches across.
Okay, Mr. Donnelly. It's fairly dramatic.
Despite the force, the spread is too narrow from this range. They try again, this time from a distance of 7 meters or 21 feet. The area of impact is now too large. They try a compromise at a distance of 5 meters or 15 feet. They have a match. Their conclusion overturns a long-held belief that may reveal how William escaped with his life.
It's always been believed that the suspects were immediately outside the door, but this testing today has proven to us that the suspects were about 16 or 17 feet away. Maybe that explains why, with the darkness, they mistook John Donnelly for William and shot him and thought that they'd accomplished their purpose and then left the crime scene.
February 4th, 1880. John Donnelly lies cold. The main Donnelly farmhouse sits in ruins. The 4 charred bodies are removed. With little else to go on, police search for eyewitnesses. Johnny O'Connor, afraid for his own life, comes forward and begins to name names. According to the boy, the person in the bedroom doorway was none other than James Carroll, local constable and leader of the inner core of the Peace Society. In his modern investigation, Michael Boyd has already singled him out as a key person of interest. Police have a second eyewitness in William Donnelly. When he peered outside, he claims to have recognized at least 3 men.
I saw John Kennedy, James Carroll, and James Ryder. These persons are well known to me.
Detective Boyd now goes over the stories of the 2 eyewitnesses word by word.
And I'm seeing, in essence, the same kind of testimony coming from William Donnelly as I'm seeing coming from Johnny O'Connor. The psychological commitment to the words are important. The use of pronouns. Speaking in first person, past tense, is important, and I'm seeing all of that.
William Donnelly claims to have seen others as well. Based on the 2 eyewitness accounts, 6 men in total are charged. At the top of the list are James Carroll and John Kennedy. For Michael Boyd, these two names come as little surprise. His modern investigation has already shown that Constable James Carroll and William's brother-in-law, John Kennedy, held long-standing grudges against the Donnelly family. Back in 1880, news of one of the worst mass murders in Canadian history spreads quickly. That same week, a funeral is held for James, Johanna, Tom, John, and Bridget Donnelly. Father Connolly, the man behind the formation of the Peace Society, officiates over the service.
He was actually quite upset at the funeral for the Donnellys. He openly broke down at the altar. He said something like, "I'm aware that people might get in fights at night, but I never knew they'd go to such lengths as this."
A trial date is set for the fall, but despite the two eyewitnesses, pitfalls begin to surface as the community closes ranks around its own. Few are willing to speak of the Peace Society and its membership, and few come forward with information about the mob.
They were all terrified. Everybody was living in fear after that. After those people were butchered and burned to death, and no one was talking to anybody because who knew when it was going to be, who was going to be next.
Homicide detective Michael Boyd is trying to shed new light on the legendary massacre of 5 members of the Donnelly family. Having recreated the night of the murders, he sifts through documents related to the trial that followed, a trial that captivated the entire country. October 1880, London, Ontario. 6 men are held in custody for the cold-blooded crime. If the eyewitnesses are to be believed, as many as 30 others, some of them pillars of the local community, also played a role in the murders. Confessions in court could start a domino effect, sending many prominent men to the gallows. For the prosecution, there is an early setback. Attempts to move the proceedings further from the scene of the crime fail.
So you had the trials were being done in the same area where the mob had all their power, where people were either afraid of the mob or supportive of the mob.
Presumed mob leader James Carroll is the first to face the court. With little physical evidence, the case against the accused rests squarely on the shoulders of the 2 eyewitnesses, William Donnelly and young Johnny O'Connor. On the stand, Johnny O'Connor once again paints a terrifying picture of the night of February 4th. He recalls hiding beneath the bed and watching as the Donnellys are killed. He again claims that the ringleader was Constable James Carroll.
The boy was called up and proceeded to tell what he had seen. And there were creatures right behind him that wanted to kill him.
This little kid, Johnny O'Connor, was, in my view, one of the few heroes of the Donnelly story.
In court, William Donnelly is next, recalling the slaying of his brother John and the figures he glimpsed when he peered outside. For the surviving members of the Donnelly family watching the court proceedings, there is a firm belief that justice will soon be done. After a week of testimony, the jury retires, but they have trouble reaching a verdict.
There's the truth about what happened, then there's the proof about what happened, and then there's the what's the jury going to do about it?
At a second trial, a new jury is more successful. To many, the verdict is a shock. Constable James Carroll is found not guilty. In the courtroom, cheers erupt from the anti-Donnelly faction. For much of the country, not to mention the surviving members of the Donnelly family, an entire community has gotten away with murder.
The jury basically chickened out.
But the jury didn't have the guts to convict. And can you honestly say if you were on that jury, you would have convicted? I don't know if I have that much guts myself.
All they had to do was drive by the Donnelly homestead and see the ashes, and that would be pretty scary.
With ringleader James Carroll acquitted, the Crown has no choice but to drop charges against the remaining 5 men.
The second verdict was really like the stake through the heart of justice.
No one was ever punished for the Donnelly murders. No one was ever found guilty. No one served major prison time or was hung for that. And because of that, there is no ending to the story. There's no closure.
But how could such a brutal massacre go unpunished? Some have suggested that Johnny O'Connor was simply too young to be relied upon with the lives of 6 men hanging in the balance. As for William, his own history of being at odds with the law undermined his credibility. When he named names, perhaps he was simply settling old scores. Detective Michael Boyd's reinvestigation has already proven that the accused men had clear motives. But now, using the tools of scientific content analysis, or SCAN, he has turned up the most damning proof to have surfaced in more than a century. According to Boyd, there is now little doubt that Johnny O'Connor and William Donnelly were both telling the truth about what happened and who they saw on that cold February night in 1880.
At no point in the statement do I see any evasiveness in any of their testimony. Nowhere do I see them trying to back away from making a firm psychological commitment to the words that they're using to describe the experience that they lived. That's, in essence, they're telling the truth. Their testimony is truthful, and therefore it ought to have been seen as being credible.
They have passed a lie detector test capable of reaching back in time. From a modern perspective, it seems clear that James Carroll and his accomplices should have gone to the gallows.
Based on a re-examination of the evidence and with the support of Michael Boyd's modern investigative techniques, it is my opinion as a lawyer that if the case were tried today, the jury would convict the men accused of the Donnelly murders, find them guilty.
For years, William Donnelly continues to search for new evidence to bring the murderers of his family to justice. He dies relatively young in the year 1897. History now seems to show that the Donnellys were blamed for far more crimes than they ever could have committed. But if they were scapegoats in life, they were even more so in death. They, not their murderers, became the legendary villains beyond the reach of justice. Perhaps myths of an uncontrollable family helped appease an entire community's guilty conscience.
Rather than face why were 5 people murdered in the middle of the night, it's this big effort to somehow make it seem like they deserve it.
Is it a classic case of blaming the victim? I suppose so. Otherwise, they would have to take responsibility that there were murderers in their midst.
I just feel sad. I feel sad for everybody concerned because I'm sure as a descendant I feel sad that justice wasn't done. So there comes a time when you have to bury the blood and just move on. It's not my fault, or it's not the descendants of James Carroll's fault for what happened 120 years ago. It's time to move on, that's all. You don't rest well as long as you're seeking vengeance, or as long as you hold a grudge. And I hope the grudges are all gone, for everybody's sake, for the people of the community, for the vigilante descendants, and for the Donnelly descendants. Move on and sleep well.